Good morning, everybody. A very big thank you for joining us this morning. Delighted that you've been able to make it today. We've been really excited and at the anticipation of joining, was being joined this morning by Hannah Absalon, or should I say Dr. Hannah Absalon, as she is now known. For the launch event for our latest report, Rethinking Regulated Housing in England, Home as an Emotional Place. So this is a little bit different this morning than those that are accustomed to joining our usual kind of Wednesday webinar sessions. This is going to be a kind of hopefully interactive, but we're going to hear and receive a presentation from Hannah about what I consider at least a groundbreaking research for the housing sector on emotional insight work. Then we're going to do a kind of a Q&A specifically with Hannah to find out a little bit more about Hannah as a person, her motivations, and her experience of doing the research. Then we will have the opportunity to have open discussion, Q&A, where you can all ask various questions about the contents of the report. So hopefully a number of you have been able to read the report, which has been freely available for the last couple of weeks on our website and elsewhere. So just a few things on logistics. I'm really pleased to see a broad mix of different attendees who've been able to make it today. Whilst these are not mutually exclusive, we've got a number of tenants, we've got a number of landlord representatives, a number of academics. So it's a really good mix, and hopefully that will contribute to the quality of the discussions, the chat and the Q&A as we work through. As usual, we are recording this morning's session, so fingers crossed we'll be able to publish the recording from today's session on our YouTube channel later today. We will send anybody who's booked on for this event will receive a follow-up email. In that email will include a link to that recording and also a link to the slides which we'll be using today as well. So just let a few late people joining in. Again, as usual, we've got a chat function. I'm pleased that we'll be supported today by Leslie Channon, who's going to be monitoring the chat, and I'll be hi Leslie, good morning. So I'll be handing over to Leslie a little bit later for the emerging questions and themes that have been coming from the chat also. So we've put everybody onto mute as well, just so that there's no interference as we've been going through from background noise and things, but hopefully there'll be the opportunity for direct questions and things as well as we work through. So first things first, I'm going to hand over to Hannah, and Hannah's going to give a brief summary and introduction for the next 15 minutes or so, just on the report, so we're all clear about what the findings are from the report, the recommendations, and that will lead nicely into the Q&A and interview, which will follow that. So Hannah, welcome.
Hello, hiya.
Thank you.
Hi everyone. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go on.
No, it's great. So I know you've got a presentation, so hopefully that will share. I'm going to put myself onto mute and take my face off so everyone can focus on what's important this morning. But I'll be here in the background, and hopefully this will all work.
Excellent. Hi, I'm gonna, just to let everyone know, I'm gonna have to stop my video because it always causes issues when I'm doing a presentation. If you've got questions as I do the presentation, if you can drop them in the chat and they'll get picked up later. And later on in the discussion, just pop your hand up and we'll get round to you. But I'm just going to stop my video and then share my screen. Nope. That's...
We can't see you now, Hannah.
Yeah, I'm just...
Can still hear you.
Can you? Yes, it's
and
done.
we can now see the presentation, and it's in presentation mode. Brilliant.
Excellent. It was confusing me by offering to share the entire screen as well as the presentation. So now I'm just going to highlight some key insights and a bit of background to the Home as an Emotional Place report. I hope everyone's had a chance to at least read the exec summary, because otherwise this conversation might be a little bit fast or not make too much sense. But I hope it gives you enough of an insight. So if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, you're interested in reading it after this. So I'm going to outline a bit of the research underpinning the report. It's not an opinion piece. It's based on 4.5 years of thesis research and then funding, continuation funding after that. I'm going to unpack some of the key findings, talk about a process I didn't write about in the report, save your eyes in reading an even bigger report, and just conclude a bit with why emotions matter and what next steps are. We'll send around this presentation afterwards, I think, and you'll see a link to our campaign and the report as well. So the research underpinning the report is based on my thesis research examining the use of behavioural insights in English regulated housing. The topic of behavioural insights is vast, and I think the way it has been applied has caused a lot of suspicion, correctly in a lot of ways, and mistrust as to how it's used. But I think it's important to understand that, you know, these insights do actually insights into the psychological impact of living in circumstances of poverty. So, you know, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's a lot to unpack. But yeah, through my thesis, I critiqued some of the ways behavioural insights had been used in the English regulated housing sector. But I also chose to explore whether there was expressions that worked for tenants, basically centering what tenants need and want from social housing, and whether an argument could be made to realign services around these. I think it's just helpful to know that there's two key assumptions of new behavioural ideas that are particularly interesting. The first is that policy and practice should be informed by an understanding of how human beings actually think and behave. Prior to these new behavioural insights being used in policy, it tended to be created in a way to encourage people to behave in ways that politicians and experts thought people should behave. So it was very should based, you know, people should not smoke, people should do more exercise, and it wasn't really attuned with an understanding of what people actually do and how their minds actually work. So that's why it became very popular, basically. And also another assumption of new behavioural ideas is that environments rather than individuals are key locations for interventions. It can take a bit to get your mind around this, because I don't think it's very strong in the English mindset to think in terms of sort of like intervening in environments. And I know when I spent some time in the Netherlands, because I was supposed to be doing international research, I thought the Dutch seemed to have a little bit more confidence and orientation towards thinking in an environmental way. I do describe the Netherlands a bit like Minecraft. They just seem to be more comfortable with those sorts of interventions. But yeah, through my thesis, I explored the utility of an interdisciplinary framework. That's just a fancy way of saying I took some insights from psychology and economics and some insights from geography, put them together to create a way to think. And I used this framework to rethink allocation processes as home creation processes. So in my thesis, I was really sort of exploring, right, yeah, there's critiques of how behavioural insights are used, but is there value in reimagining the work of social housing? I chose allocations as I think it's a fundamental process we get wrong in the sector. And it's also a key site where landlords and tenants first meet. And the third motivation is it's a transitional space, really. So where things may have gone well in other areas of support, it's where things can break down, problems can re-emerge. It's a very tricky time for new tenants. This seemed to capture the imagination of the ESRC. They are an academic funding research body, the Economic Social Research Council, and the William Sutton Prize as well. So I managed to get some funding to explore this idea of home creation. I have to say, what was initially proposed was a bit more of a, let's get together a party of the willing who can see the value of this and see if we can apply some of these home creation ideas. What I actually found as I was doing this research is there were so many barriers to applying this more emotional understanding of allocations that I wrote about those instead. And I just think it's important to note there was a lot of enthusiasm, but the enthusiasm didn't turn to translate into actually trying the insights out. So I'm just going to summarize some key findings. Now, obviously in the report, I've not written about absolutely everything. I've drawn out 3 key processes that I thought were relevant and forefronted an understanding of the home that I think should be the fundamental basis for how the regulated housing sector does its work. So I'll start with that. And that's the idea that home is an emotional place, so the title of the report. And I'll just read this quotation from it. A home is more than bricks and mortar. A home is an emotional place. By understanding and working with the dual understanding of the importance of a stable home in good condition and the emotional value of home and landlord services, a new perspective emerges to inform the current review of the English regulated housing sector. So what I'm trying to communicate with that statement there is you can't separate the material environment, so the quality of the home itself and the neighbourhoods and the emotional state that home engenders in us and we also give to home. It's a slightly more complicated and nuanced understanding, but I think it's something we can grasp intuitively. And this is why we talk a bit about putting the heart back into housing, home as an emotional place. And it just sort of accentuates some of the emphasis that's been placed on the quality of a home. We're kind of saying, you can't separate out the emotional value of a home as well. And it's a really valuable perspective to rethink housing. So this fundamental understanding or re-understanding of what home is, in some ways it's simplifying as it provides a clear expression of where the value of regulated housing work lies. I think the sector's got very lost as to what its purpose is and has got very disconnected from just focusing on the core value of home. So this should be like a reorientation point, basically, just to connect people back to how home is important. It's also complicating in that new thinking frameworks and methods of working are needed to enact this perspective. So I've been exploring some of this in another phase of funding I've been doing with TAROE Trust called Feeling at Home, which has involved working with involved tenants and exploring some different ways of working with emotions. I won't detour off onto that. But yeah, there are challenges around how you bring these emotional perspectives to life and new ways of working. It's challenging, as I say, how far has the sector travelled from this core understanding? But I think it's uniting as well. There is something connective about an emotional understanding. I think there's ways we can work towards just a shared understanding that can overcome some of the barriers to coming together and working to bring about change. The first process I looked at in the report is stigma. I think stigma is a huge problem within the regulated housing sector. The more I think about it, the more it just becomes apparent it's a core issue. I won't bore you with Kid Problems framework. And it's basically a way of working with problems that are considered socially complex. A tame problem might be something like, how do I put a new window in? I measure it, I get the right size window, I put it in, job done. Something like stigma or poverty, those are really messy, complicated problems, and sometimes the interventions can cause more problems. So it's important to know whether you're dealing with a complex problem or whether you're dealing with a simple problem. And stigma is a wicked problem. This framework, I think, provides a means to think about stigma differently. So there's an element of simplification to it. It's also, again, complicating in that stigma is framed as a battle that can't be won, yet something that must be engaged with iteratively. And that just means like you can't do these sort of like task and finish initiatives when approaching with stigma, because your intervention is very likely to just create more stigma, because it's a problem that happens at multiple layers in society. And until the tenure of regulated housing is equivalentized with other tenures, it's just going to be a perpetual problem. But it doesn't mean we can't do something within the space we are now. And also I thought this approach as well is a challenge to what I see as a tendency within the regulated sector to seek out simplification and simplified solutions, which are described in my thesis as like skating over the real complex problems that tenants are experiencing in housing services in their day-to-day lives. Sometimes simplification is useful, but I think it helps, as I say, to know when a problem's complicated. It's uniting, again, as stigma is seen as a collective problem, and we need to reflect on its individuals on its influences at an individual, organisation and cultural level. And also stigma cuts off a view of the home as essential in providing stability and identity production, i.e. who we are and how we feel about ourselves. And so tackling stigma sort of helps remove some of the fog that's created by it and helps us connect with an emotional perspective. So there's so much in stigma and a real value of approaching it through that framework. The second process I drew out is a bit of a dry one. So, you know, thank you to all the accountancy academics who've written some what I find interesting papers, but I don't think many do. So you need to sort of have a little bit of a sense of what social value is, and we do outline some explanations to it in the report. So if you're not too sure, please go and have a look at the report to contextualise, or else I'll just end up boring you all to death. To measure the value, the social value of some work that landlords do. And we argue in the report that it's a poor fit in terms of accounting for the stability and psychological meaning of homes in our lives. There is a need to account for the social value of core housing services, believe it or not, allocations are not considered socially valuable, such as repairs and furnished tenancies. Furthermore, there is a need for a new approach to governance that understands what is socially and emotionally valuable for tenants in terms of their home and home-related services. This, again, it's simplifying. It draws attention to how accountancy frameworks and other business tools, anyone who knows me knows I've got to be in my bonnet about surveys, and this is, you know, part of this, how you understand how tenants are experiencing services and homes, you know, shapes how you engage with those problems. And these sorts of simplifying tools are not capturing the depth of these problems. So it draws attention to how these tools, which are not really questioned or challenged in the sector, are partly producing the problems of the sector. It's complicated. It calls for a process orientation to social value that is open. Huge challenge to organisations that tend to be a bit risk averse. And this is really what we did with the Feeling at Home research. Is I went in with one question, and from collaborating and researching together with tenants, we ended up with a very different approach to where we intended to start from, but one that I think is more valuable and has revealed more hidden problems within housing that we've talked about it and discussed it, we can work with. It's challenging. Proxy social measures are embedded in the sector, so there's, you know, it's a bit of a challenge for people to want to change this, and there is a broader discussion needed on whether to reform them, move away from them, or do something hybrid. And also I think there's something uniting about drawing out this discussion of social value. It is hidden, it's a bit dry, but if we can name it, we can change it. So I think we need to inject some energy really into what is quite a dry topic. The third process I discussed was rethinking tenant participation. I wasn't talking about independent tenant activism in this. I was talking about what's encouraged for social landlords to engage with tenants in the delivery of the work. Again, if you've not read the report, I really encourage you just to have a look at this section, because there's some ideas in there that need a bit of contextualising. But long story short, I call for a lab model informed by the values of citizen science. And basically 3 sort of tiered approach, which I took from an excellent paper, which talks about whether they're problems which are by, with, or for the people, because then that determines how much involvement is needed in problems, what other experts you might need, and where responsibilities lie. So anyway, this is simplifying. It names a process and outlines 3 modes, and that enables collective discussions about what participation processes should look like for different problems. It's complicating. Values of citizen science basically require ethics to be discussed, and it requires knowledge and skills about social research. It's challenging to power. Who gets to name the problem? It's also for tenants as well, busy lives and uneven engagements, which just basically means, you know, not everyone can contribute to everything all the time. But again, I think by having these conversations, it allows for that sort of like tiered involvement. Also, it surfaces more conflict and disagreement, but I'm of the view that, you know, it's there anyway. So it needs to be sort of dealt with, drawn out, and sort of engaged with, not ignored and pushed aside. And it's uniting. Shared decision making and increased accountability and transparency can collectively decide when a problem is by, with, or for the people, and have different mechanisms around these. So there's a lot of challenge in the report as to how things are done and how things are structured. I didn't write about a 4th process, and that's the role of digital technologies and advanced data analytics. And how these are sort of like selling simplification. Someone called Stratheim describes this as solutions chasing problems, and pushing out complex and messy emotional understandings. There's this whole discourse that's very culturally popular about tech for good, and I'm not against it, but I am against the unreflective use of such technologies. Also, my research revealed as well that there's unquestioned assumptions that these technologies can correct our flawed thinking. I'm not going to go off on one about that one. I need to write something about it at another date that allows me to get these ideas out in a way that is easy to understand. But yeah, it's just, there's this idea that you can apply technology to treat and solve extremely complex social problems. And my argument is no, you need to think about it, have a deep understanding of the problem, and collectively decide when technology is a good fit. So I've seen some brilliant examples, such as using technology to help people choose what colour they might want a wall painted, or what decorating they might want in a property. But I've seen some really worrying examples, which I won't go into. But yeah, there's other processes as well, but I want to be clear, this report focuses on the institutional space, fancy way of saying what landlords do, and there are other processes around national welfare and housing policy more broadly, i.e., you know, the poor rates of social security and this tendency to centre home ownership. I have written a reaction piece actually that's available on TAROE Trust's LinkedIn page about how emotional insights can contribute to social security reform and support Grand Union's campaign. So, you know, I touch on that, but not in this report. Right, we're getting to the end. We know home is an emotional place. It can connect us with an understanding of home that centres our individual and collective needs as humans. So I'm really about this idea of how can we help individuals connect with their homes, and how can we connect and understand each other and our needs better through this emotional understanding. Related services, homelessness, social services, are already working with emotionally informed approaches. Obviously, it's often trauma-informed approaches, but there's more to it than just that. Yet these practices haven't entered general needs housing. There's this cliff edge that doesn't really make a lot of sense. And I think there's questions to ask around, are we setting people up to fail? Are we failing on opportunities to build good, trusting relationships? And fundamentally, the sector's got a reputational crisis. And I think there's a risk of compounding this by not working with emotionally informed perspectives and processes that engage with these. So, you know, we're not wanting to attack what landlords are doing. Landlords are operating in extremely complicated, difficult circumstances. And I know there are excellent people who really, really want to do the best they can by tenants, but there seems to be, I would argue, a disconnect between how the activity of landlords meets and works with the needs of tenants. The housing crisis is only going to get worse. Just in my personal life, I've had 4 people who never expected to be homeless be made homeless. And so that's going to result in more traumatised people in regulated housing. Policy level emotional understanding centres and makes visible the importance of home in our lives, its role in health and well-being of a nation. A home is not an investment vehicle. Home is the fundamental foundation for living a life worth living. I think we need to reconnect with that. So, next steps. We're exploring the how of working with emotional insights and co-production processes. I've touched upon the feeling at home research, and what was really interesting was the tenants who took part in this really wanted to talk about anger and fear, and I thought that was such a valuable bit of work. I'm writing a report about this. Fancy language, but it's going to be a reflective resource to facilitate conversations, not a prescriptive list of how to do things. And we are seeking to create connections between organisations and individuals who see the value in this work. So specific asks, we're looking for partners to research and produce an emotionally informed approach to conducting home visits. We're very aware that there's well-intentioned landlords who will be conducting housing audits, and we're very concerned that that could be damaging to the tenant-landlord relationship when we think it's a great opportunity to build connections. And broadly, we want to explore emotional insights and co-production more broadly, and work with organisations willing to connect with this perspective. Find out more. We've got a campaign called Let's Put Park into Housing. TAROE Trust is a red in terms of campaigning, supporting tenants, and basically working for tenants, advice, campaigning, research and training. Please sign up to their newsletter. Please subscribe also to the LinkedIn page as well to keep things going. And I'll end it there. I'll hand over to Darren to ask some questions. Then we'll do questions from the chat, and then we'll finish with broader questions. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Hannah. That's really insightful. I can see as you've been going through, there's been lots and lots of questions and points and comments that have been made, which are things which we're going to need to kind of return to and weave into the next part of this event. So firstly, before we kind of go on to that, we thought it might just be a really good opportunity to be able to find out a little bit more about yourself, about your motivations, what's driven you to undertake this research, and where things are going to be moving next. So if we kick off with that, I'd just really, well, it was kind of an obvious thing really to start from, but I'd love to kind of know what it is that kind of personally motivated you to get involved in this sector, and particularly involved in this research. Were there personal motivations in your own life story that have led you to this point?
Yeah, I remember being about 8 years old and first coming across like the concept of homelessness by seeing homeless people, and just being so like, this does not make any sense to me. Why is this happening? And I think there's a bit of me that carries that childlike incredulity that this is a thing that happens. and that's sort of been this drive that's just made me sort of very passionate about rethinking housing. I sort of came into the sector in my late teens doing a neighbourhood officer role in the area I used to work in. And from there, I've done various roles. And I just got to a point as well where I just sort of, I think a lot of practitioners can relate to this. You want to be doing something that's useful, and you just feel really disconnected from your work. I opened my thesis talking about how I'd set up a volunteer program, and I had some amazing volunteers in the constant crashes they kept having in trying to actualize themselves and do everything they were supposed to do. And the system that was around them just seemed to keep stopping them from doing that. And so it was my own experiences of being raised in council housing, seeing homelessness, and trying to work within a system that didn't seem to actually be working for the people who it said it did. That's really driven me to do this. And also just a quite a nerdy kid as well. So I am the type of person who likes studying, and I've had the privilege to be able to take it to a doctoral level. And there's a bit of me that I think I look back on the estate I was brought up on as well. And I'm quite proud of my younger self for going on this trajectory of, nowadays you don't really expect a lass raised in Hyde Park in Leeds to be in a position campaigning for social change and having a doctorate. So it's a strange trajectory, but it's motivated by quite a lot of personal experiences and working with others and seeing things I just think are wrong.
So it's been quite a journey, but it's something that kind of weaves in, and there's a clear kind of connectiveness right back to your childhood, which kind of makes sense, the journey that you've been on, the trajectory that you've been on. It's very clear, therefore, that there's this locked in passion. If you, in terms of, and I guess you're privileged as well to be able to directly engage with others, to explore where there are kind of similarities and differences in their own experiences. So when you've been doing that, is there anything that you found that has maybe you didn't expect to find in your research, anything that surprised you, or anything that's been particularly rewarding?
I just want to pick up on that point of it being a privilege, being in a position where people share their stories and tell me what's going on. I think we've lost value of the importance of telling each other who we are and about our lives. And one of the things that I sort of emphasize in my research is this requires humility, to be able to listen and engage and connect with people, a human being to human being. So as I explored in my research, I was quite surprised in some ways at the role, how many decisions were being made that were claimed to be rational when they were actually driven by ego and success. And some of the best projects came when people in the sector were being vulnerable and accepting things needed to be done differently. And I think what's a big sort of surprise through the research was finding actually perspectives that really seem to resonate with tenants and practitioners. So when I developed this home creation process, it seemed to catalyse interest from practitioners. And when we've undertaken the feeling at home research, I've never had so many people interested in a project. I mean, it took me almost a year to interview 42 people for my thesis. Within 2.5 weeks, we got 37 people express interest in feeling at home. So I think this is something I've just been quite surprised at, but excited by. Is there something here to unpack and explore? And I'm interested really in seeing where this journey might go, really, and working with others to explore it.
So I mean, we at TAROE Trust can definitely say we found it an enlightening process, and I think it demonstrates that there's some value for that kind of independent voice. I really want to be able to, and I know that there's been a number of comments on this in the chat function. I absolutely want to be able to get into the kind of the more nitty gritty of unpicking how practically these things can be applied. Before we get into kind of exploring that a little bit more, what I'd really like to do is just kind of more generically talk about, we've learned about your backstory, we learned about the research that we've got now. What have we got coming up next? So the future plans?
I'll come to future plans, but I just also want to emphasise this idea of independence. I think it's important to understand that the tenant-landlord relationship is one riddled with power, and no matter what you do, that power dynamic is always going to be there, always has been there, always will be there. And so there are roles for independent research, independent activity to sort of come in and bridge that gap. And in terms of future plans, really, at a personal level, I'm looking at doing something called a fellowship, which is where you didn't have enough time to do stuff during your PhD, so you ask for some more money to write papers and stuff. So that's what I've done, and also I've asked for some funding to research what we're calling emotional encounters in the home, because that came up in our feeling at home work, was how important these small encounters between tenants and landlords were in the home, and how these small interactions could have huge psychological consequences for tenants. And we're looking as well is connecting with people who are wanting to explore these ideas more broadly. Because one thing we found with these emotional perspectives, like through the discussing anger and fear with tenants in the feeling at home research, so many avenues came up where emotional insights could be useful and helpful. So I'm writing a report at the moment looking at a tenant representative's experience of domestic abuse. So this was a huge topic that came up from the research, and sort of emphasising that there's a lot that's happening in the sector of domestic abuse. Some of it we could be doing far better, but it's never really talked about how tenant representatives and community volunteers are often taking on some burden for working with people who are surviving domestic abuse. We're trying to help access to services and doing some really important hidden work. So this is what this report's trying to do, is draw out the stories of tenant representatives who might be doing that, to make it visible, but also to facilitate more broader conversations, not just with tenant representatives, but with practitioners, with the tenant population more broadly, to encourage more tailored interventions and draw out some of the assumptions we make about this extremely complicated topic, and why we just keep not doing it as well as we could. Issues of repairs, issues, as I say, of the interaction between tenants and landlords in the home. We know as well there's emotional insights can potentially help with retrofit programs. Basically, whatever the day-to-day work is that landlords are doing, an emotional perspective can just bring new insights and ideas to it that can I think, get it done better, as well as engaging with tenants and drawing out hidden problems that landlords are not even seeing.
So thanks for that. So you've gone on a little bit in terms of some of the application of the work. I think just to kind of backpedal just slightly, in relation, you mentioned about the Feeling at Home project, which is something we've been working with you on here at TAROE Trust. We're looking at there being another couple of report outputs that should come out over the summer, which will develop some of this emotional insight findings. And we're also looking to do some follow-on work beyond that, if the funding, which fingers crossed we'll know in a couple of months, moves ahead, which is around home visits specifically. And home visits has been something which has been a really topical issue on the back of the Better Social Housing Review, which made the recommendation about property audits. And we've learned quite a lot from a number of different landlords that have been sort of expanding the neighbourhood management teams in order to be able to undertake those additional level of home visits. And of course, as you highlighted there in terms of practical application, those emotional insights are really important for any kind of practical application where the landlord is going to be going into somebody's home, and the need to remember that whilst you as a landlord might be seeing this is another one of their properties in their overall portfolio of possibly thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands, even for that is that individual's home.
Yeah.
So in effect, it's kind of anything, isn't it? Where we're doing that, and you can kind of apply. I remember in the Feeling at Home research, one of the things which came out quite early on in that was that the academic research that was done was quite niche and quite specialist.
Yeah.
Why do you think that might be the case as opposed to more generic application?
I think there's something about emotions not being seen as sort of serious. You know, they're seen as this sort of like frivolous thing. And academia has got, I mean, I've never felt so working class in my life since I've been doing this PhD. So there's these sort of like cultural norms about what is serious to research and what isn't. And there's disparate fields, like there's some, you know, very scientific understandings of the emotions effects on the brain and like biology. And then there's fields that I think are taken a little less seriously or harder to relate to in the public domain, such as human geography, which talks in very complicated ways about emotion. So like geography takes the perspective that, you know, we have ambivalent relationships with home. And that really fueled my interest in researching anger and fear, because there's a tendency within the sector to focus on satisfaction. Well, that's not how people relate to their home. They relate to their home in complex ways emotionally, and it's drawing out some of that. And I think there's just a little bit of, certainly within practice, there's been this dominance that you can rationally understand and control everything and reduce its risks. And that thinking has just dominated too far. It's like Pandora's box. It's starting to seep into areas where, you know, you can't manage risks so brilliantly. Life is messy. There are complicated threads, and that just makes people sort of worry and then overcompensate emotionally. This is what I think is going on with technology as well, where they get, you know, some landlords are getting so they can see the complexity of what's happening in the sector and in tenants' lives, and instead of engaging with it, they're doubling down on rational approaches through technology, and just distancing themselves further. So there's a lot of complex interplay between, you know, what's considered status-driven research, like co-productive research. So working with, like we did in Feeling at Home, where we collaborated and worked together, is considered quite low status research by some. To me, I think it's an absolutely essential way of working with people, and it's just something I think there needs to be some pushback in academia about the value of collaborating. And as I said, it's a privilege when people tell you their stories. We're all experts in living our own lives, and there needs to be more understanding of that and communication and talking with each other. So yeah, there's stuff going on in academia, and there's also stuff going on in practice that's accentuating this over celebration of rationality at the expense of understanding what it means to be human.
So I'm going to come back to a few things just to highlight there. So in relation to what you're talking about, that there's kind of the process, and process was quite a key aspect of this report. The actual process that you follow is almost kind of as important as the outcomes that are coming from this, because it's the process through which it's the people's experience, and that's the kind of the emotional and behavioral insights. So on that, certainly for practical application, something that we can offer on the back of this is around the actual process of engagement, and the need for that to be about co-production and about engagement and about emotion informed, and how you go about that. And there are techniques and approaches which is probably beyond today's discussion, but there are a range of different techniques and approaches which are scientifically or academically proven, which inform that co-production process.
Yeah.
There are then kind of toolkits there that you've got, where you've talked about where you can look at specific areas. So wicked problems came out there about the nature of messy things and wicked problems, and I know that there was a chat earlier about how can kind of those wicked problems be kind of worked through, especially in relation to stigma. To kind of the practical application, how might that work? So are you able to say anything just really quite quickly, because I'm aware of time, on the wicked problems toolkit?
Oh, those, I'd say this is going to be such an academic thing to say. It's a framework rather than a toolkit. I describe it as a lens to think through. So it's because I think of tool scripts as like a prescriptive list. You know, I'll do this activity and then I've done a thing. What wicked problems allows you to do, it's like putting on a new pair of glasses when you don't know you're struggling with vision. It just gives you a new way of looking at the problem. And what I would encourage when using something like wicked problems is it's something you can keep returning back to when engaging with something like stigma in a group setting. So the 10 points give you something to discuss. And it can be really helpful in overcoming some of the challenges of working together. So one of the points is there's only a one-shot opportunity when you're dealing with a problem, because what happens is when you do an intervention, you then change the nature of the problem. So I give the example of the use of customer segmentation as being used as a means to try and reduce stigma by increasing understanding of different tenant profiles. So that's a one shot. You've used customer segmentation, but what you've done is you've reformulated the problem of stigma. And I talk about this a bit in my thesis about how you've not got rid of stigma, you've just changed how stigma is understood. And by not understanding how customer segmentation is built on quite a few logical fallacies, and you're still ending up with this spectrum of good tenant to bad tenant. It's just slightly more like granulated. And so you can't step away and then say, oh, we've resolved stigma, oh, we understand tenants better. And there's weird effects as well, such as people using tenant avatars to have one-sided conversations. So one of the weird effects of using customer segmentation was it disengaged landlords from actually understanding tenants' lives and tenants' experiences, whilst making the claim they were better understanding tenants' lives and experiences. And this is the complexity, but the wicked problems makes you think about those unintended consequences and strange effects. So that makes, so in terms of the service changes that might come about as a result of the application of this way of thinking, my understanding is that effectively it could be anything where you're interacting directly with tenants, because it's about being more mindful and aware of the manner in which, or the process through which those services are being delivered. Is that fair? I'd also say wherever you have human beings interacting with other human beings, and also where you have human beings interacting with things like technology.
So that's where I was going to go with that as the next one. So exactly, because this is not, and I think there's a friction here, isn't there, in the sector, that you're seeing a kind of increased rationalization. You've got cost controls, you've got kind of this movement towards chatbots, AI. You've almost got kind of quite a lot of pressure pushing people away from those human interactions.
Yes.
Which is in direct conflict to this about the need to be emotionally informed. So where do you see this going?
I'm also cautious about technologies that claim to be emotionally informed, because when you unpick it, it's underpinned by quantitative understandings. And I'm very for human interactions and messiness and non-quantitative understanding. This is why I need to write something else about the effects of digital technology, because there's a lot to unpack. Where I think things are going is, in some ways, I'm not massively optimistic, because I think people's egos are embedded in making and money, there's a lot of money are embedded in making some quite questionable decisions. But saying that, I think it's important to create a counter position that kind of goes, no, you're just heading towards this direction none of us want to end up in, which isn't going to work brilliantly for anyone. Pull it back a bit and let's rethink how what we're doing. And it's about, let's start from understanding in housing the importance of the built environment of the home, the emotional meaning of home, have conversations about this, engage with the complexity, engage with the disagreement, use some of these thinking frameworks when working together in processes to create new perspectives and build things from there. It's going to be messy. There's going to be things that emerge that you didn't think were problems. There's going to be ceiling limits. Landlords can't do everything. But if you can have those conversations and you've gone through the process of working it through together, then at least you understand there's a ceiling limit. And then that can inform things like TAROE's advocacy work and campaigns for change and things like that. So it's I just think let's start collaborating. Let's stop reacting so much to what's being done, pull together and start campaigning together for change in the sector that centres tenants' experiences of home and more reforms in the sector more broadly.
Brilliant. I'm going to go over to Leslie in a moment because I know Leslie's been monitoring the chat and there's been lots of different sort of themes that have been coming out there, and I can see stuff about leadership, culture change. Are there any, Leslie, any questions you particularly, before we kind of open it up sort of for others to ask some questions, anything that kind of stood out for you to highlight?
Yeah, I've been doing this as well as tweeting, so it's been like a bit crazy, but yeah, so the chat, several things that have come up. I think John's question is, can you give us a couple of examples of the sort of service changes that might arise if landlords were to take full account of the approach you're talking about? I think that's a huge question, but I think it's really important about, what that would actually look like. Yeah. And then just before we and then it's all about the human interactions and the fear of like the whole group. Actually, there was kind of a whole discussion about a lot of landlords are moving away into AI and chat boxes, and that I think John just also made another comment about the kind of human interaction that you were talking about, and that is really key. But the sector and actually humanity is moving away from that, and so how do we kind of bring that through? And then Deb kind of mentioned kind of in this whole thing about taking for granted the role of frontline staff, and that they're being kind of, if I'm understanding this correctly, is that they're being taken for granted and they're also being prevented from actually acting like humans because they're within the framework of the policies and procedures, so they're not given a lot of room to actually act like humans. So those are the three kind of threads that I think were really important that we'd like to hear from you.
Right. I think in terms of service changes, I'd say have a look in the report in terms of how I'd reimagine tenant participation processes and some indicators of how social value needs to be reformulated. So there's massive challenges to the structure of how social housing does its work. At a more intimate level, I talked about how allocations processes could be reimagined as home creation processes. And what that meant was, I think there's a potential role for technology to identify earlier on who's very likely to end up in a regulated housing property, and have conversations with people about aiding their transition into turning that property into a home. So it's things like, having conversations early with people, changing the property handover standards. I mean, I constantly go on about the complete irrationality of giving somebody who's trying to flee homelessness, fleeing domestic violence, spent a long time in a hospital or a prison or care or whatever, a completely empty box and then go and crack on and do it. And I've personally known people just bail on a tenancy because they're not being helped to settle into the home. So this emotionally informed perspective is really about humanizing that process that's just seen as one that's all about cost efficiencies. And it's more challenging to do that because there's knots of administration that are sort of keeping it as it is. And that's why I talk about the need to reform things like social value, account for the value of furnished tenancies and such like. So this.
Can I just follow up on that? Because Deb wrote, and I'm trying to put it all together, is talking about the complex societal issues with allocations. And I know that you're interested in that area too, that just kind of dumping someone within a community, you know, without the thought of the wider implications within that community that's already formed. So it's like, it isn't necessarily like it's gone to like the next person on the list as opposed to who is right for that environment.
That is such, and that's a key point in terms of thinking of environments as well. And I've had a bit of a debate with some academics, and I actually stepped back from taking part in a research project because they weren't taking on board my perspective about the impact on wider communities of slightly thoughtlessly done allocations that were slightly over focused. This is one of the problems with trauma-informed perspectives is sometimes it can encourage a rescuer dynamic rather than seeing people as complex human beings. So we get very defensive of a group of people who are very complex. And I know I've experienced it several times living in areas that are quite complex, some of the impacts of poorly made allocation decisions. And certainly in Birmingham at the moment, we're having huge problems with basically the commodification of the homelessness market. So our homeless population's gone up from 3,500 to about 20,000, I think. And there's just increasing numbers of houses of multiple occupation, incredibly poorly managed homes, not helping the people who are trying to exit homelessness, but also having a ripple out effect on communities. So absolutely, there's, you know, it's thinking about these more carefully, but I have that view as well, that if you help give someone the right home and help them feel the emotional investment, because somebody who's been repeat homeless is not going to be able to emotionally connect with the home in the same way somebody who hasn't got those experiences. And there's perverse effects, such as giving somebody who's experienced several rounds of homelessness, the stability of the home can feel chaotic, and that can set off cycles of problem behaviour. And these understandings are just not informing allocations processes. So I think it's helpful for this knowledge is there, and this is what I mean by it's just not getting into general needs housing. So yeah, it's having those conversations, and fundamentally we are operating in a context where we need more truly affordable housing. But I'm also thinking about what can be done within the space we're operating in now, because there's real hardships and harms that are happening now. I'll just talk about the point of staff being taken for granted on the front line. Yeah, absolutely. I very much agree with that. I think that's encouraging emotional disconnect. And slight spoiler alert for the report I'm writing next. One of the insights I write about is emotional labour and different types of emotional labour and how that's impacting on how domestic abuse is engaged with in a community. Because that's one of the things with emotional perspectives and where expertise is helpful. Is different insights are useful to understand different problems. So I think drawing attention to the emotional labour that tenant representatives are expected to do. Weirdly enough, there's not a lot of research about emotional labour and volunteering, and also how this rationalisation and separating staff out from their areas they work in, so they're spread really thinly rather than deeply, is undermining opportunities for emotional connection. There was another point as well about cultural values and moving further away. I think we have to.
Hannah, before you answer that, can I just give people a heads up? Whilst we're coming back and answering that question, if anyone's got any burning questions which they don't think that we have, could you put your hand up? And I'll try and monitor it, and then we can come to that afterwards. So back to you, Hannah.
Oh yeah, cool. It's And I think it is about creating a counter voice. This is how democracy should work, really. There should be a counterbalance to agendas and criticisms of agendas and more reflective thought. And as I say, I'm not anti-technology. Here we are having this conversation now on Zoom, something that we wouldn't been able to do and people wouldn't be able to access so openly. There are roles for technology to bring people together and connect people. And as I say, my concern is we're drifting towards this sort of technology will solve everything, when it won't. It'll just create new sets of problems as well as helping alleviate some old problems. So it's just unpicking that a little bit more. But I'll be quiet and give space for questions.
Thanks, Hannah. That's thought-provoking, to say the least. I can see we've got Brian and then Deb. So can I go over to Brian first?
Good morning, and nice to see you again, Hannah. You're striking a tone with me when you're talking about the technology part of it, and it does highlight itself, particularly when you're dealing, and not just with an older tenancy group, but even younger people now. The amount of younger people that I know who are shying away from, they don't want to be involved in Facebook, they don't want to be involved in Snapchat or Instagram or anything else. But they feel completely, that sector feel completely left out, because you've got landlords who are pushing everything into, oh yeah, we put it on Facebook. I'm not on Facebook. Well, that's where we put all the information. So you straight away you've put your tenancies, your people at the bottom of the list. You're not counting them as engaged people. You're not counting them as people who need that information. And a lot of the landlords are forcing their tenants, oh, you have to report it online, or, this is the quickest way to do it. And straight away, I speak to tenants on a regular basis, and they're sort of, I hate them things. I don't like going on to that area.
Yeah.
And they feel as they're not part of what's going on. They're excluded from this. They're deprived of that information because they don't do this, and they're being forced into doing something which they don't want. And to me, I'll have to say, and I'm an old hand at living in properties, in rented properties, and I've never had an issue with living in a rented property. And I think part of it is down, in a lot of cases, and I mentioned it earlier with stigma. Stigma it's everywhere, and it's being forced on people. I'm not online, so I don't count. And that whole stigma of it's like I sat some time ago and I worked it out that somebody on a basic minimum wage will work for 25 years to get the deposit for a house. So it's, I think part of it's societal, but I think part of it is being forced through because it disengages with people.
I think you make
Hannah, do you want to say anything about what Brian's saying?
I think he's hitting on the key point about disengagement, and there is a critique of the phase that we've been in for the past 40 years, which accuses it of fragmenting connections and disconnecting people. And I very much agree that's a real problem. And this is what I think one of the powerful thing about emotional insights and emotional understandings is it brings people together and it connects people. And there's an implicit threat to the political status quo, I think, and by bringing people together united by a passion to change something can be quite a powerful force, basically. So I do feel sometimes some of the popularity of these approaches that strip out emotions and strip out connections are politically useful, basically, whether consciously applied or not. I think in terms of communication, I'd love to see more engagement with local tenant reps as well as paid staff from housing, I think. And I think there's just something, again, about connecting with as human beings. I know in the block of flats where I live, no one was talking to each other until I came along and set up a WhatsApp group. And also we now have more conversations. It feels like a more friendly place to be. We're not in each other's pockets. I don't want people knocking on my door, thanks. But we do have chats, and it feels just so much of a warmer, happier, safer place to be, from just that little bit of like, no, we need to talk to each other. You know, so you bring up a load of fascinating points. Stigma absolutely operates at a multi-scaled level. Technology, it's thinking about it complexly. As I say, we're here now having this conversation, so it's bringing people together, but also how do you engage with people who can't use it as well? You've got to think of that too. So I think you raise a lot of really good points.
So before we go to Deb, and just that's Deb Chowney, I did note that some comments from Debbie Potter about who are the various things, and in this sense it was technology, but who is it benefiting? And it just made me think of there's a character in The Handmaid's Tale that I think says something like progress, but progress isn't progress for everybody. And I think you've got to, so whatever's of benefit isn't all, you've got to think who's that for, and it isn't always benefit for everybody. So it's the kind of these insights is something which might be viewed as positive, might be really negative to somebody else. So we're going to go to Carol after Deb, but can we keep both comments and responses fairly brief now, because we're of time. So Deb.
Hi all. This is going to be quick, but it sort of relates to the stigma bit, but it also relates to the technology bit. And I think one of the things is if we want to get better, everyone has to understand. This came out in a previous sort of webinar, that there is a responsibility for those in the homes as well, that they are their homes, and maybe the conversation around how they regard them could change. And part of that is to care for their environments, because actually not everything that's social is bad. But when we allow the media and the conversations around social housing to constantly hark on the bad, and we know why, let's be honest, bad headlines make good headlines for newspapers and media and social channels. So we know exactly why that occurs. The other thing is, you are absolutely right about the virtual. There is a absolute head-on rush by all housing associations to chatbot their life out of their organisations, to AI, to introduce 365, the cloud, whatever you want to call it this week. And that is actually causing issues internally with communication, because there is a difference between those that can virtually communicate articulately and get their point over, and those that hide behind poorly constructed virtual communications and miss the point, and it gets misconstrued and misunderstood. And rather than pick up a phone and spend 2 minutes like we're talking now, they'll actually spend hours composing an email so that they don't have to have those perhaps difficult conversations. And I think that's what's occurring with customers, that when you're allowed, as I am luckily in my particular part of the role, to have conversations that are not constrained by time, I get a far better response, a far better outcome, a far better interaction, a partnership with the individual, because I've talked to them, I've built up that trust and that relationship. I think time, money, but it isn't saving money. It's saving money now, but it's not going to save it later.
No, it's not. The
stigma is the arrogance that we know best. Well, actually, you don't know best, because those that work at the coalface, to call it that, do know, but they're very rarely communicated with, because we've also got internal issues with not wanting to talk to those that actually do. And then the other one is, we all live somewhere, we all have a roof, we all should be able to expect that that roof does its job. And I think that we need to just disregard some of these stigma titles and actually fight and say, doesn't matter what my rent is, doesn't matter what my title is, doesn't matter what my tenure is, actually I'm entitled to the best for the money I'm paying.
I think you make interesting points about stigma, and I'll draw attention as well to stigma has effects on how people perceive themselves, and also the accessing of housing. Like the 4 people I know recently who would be considered statutorily homeless, only one of them approached homelessness services for help because of the stigma associated with going down and being homeless. So I dread to think how many people are not appearing on the statistics because of stigma. So again, we get back to stigma then having a political function, as people are like policing themselves. It's not just how we perceive other people, it's how people police themselves. And that may also impact on the relationship people have with their homes. And so I'm of the view, let's find what insights are helpful to trigger useful conversations, because different insights will be relevant for different conversations. And this is where the process of researching and working together is important. And I think you make a lot of valid points, but I'll hand over to the next question. Over to you, Darren.
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, so before we hand over to Carol, just to give Carol a heads up this time, what we've been talking about a lot here is about behaviours. Behaviours links entirely with what we've been saying about our Respect for All in our Respect for All charter, is the importance of behaviours and understanding what tenants' expectations are in those service standards. What we've seen, there's been lots of news about on the professionalism work streams about the mandatory qualifications that are going to be in place for largely senior officers working in the sector. I think what's going under a lot of people's radar is the competency and conduct standard, which the regulator is going to have to develop following a direction from government, which is going to be much broader about about culture, about the nature of interaction with tenants in the delivery of services. So a lot of what you've been saying today is going to be very important in influencing and also getting kind of compliance with these new competency and conduct standards that will be coming into force shortly. So Carol.
Hi. Thank you. Hi, thank you. Can I just say, the lady mentioned, hi Hannah, she mentioned about allocations, and I think that's a big part of where emotions come in. Yeah. So once you're allocated a home, you move into your home, you expect it to be fine. The emotions are there, you're happy, everything's going fine, and then you realise your home is not a home you expected because of the allocations process. When you go back to the allocations process, it's not just one department like your HA, where I live, it's a numerous few departments that decide on all this. So at the end of the day, they're saying that your HA is there to help you do all this, but they're not always there to help you. They put you in a property, they don't follow up on that, or they do follow up on that, and you don't get the help you need. Yeah, I literally moved into my house in 2019. I was quite happy. I went to my HA. I did not expect what I got. All I expected them to do was come in and help me, advise me. But no, once they realised that they could not help me, that was it. Yeah. It was like, it's your fault, you're to blame, we're not changing anything, it's different places. And that's where the emotion comes in, because you as a person feel the blame because your house isn't how it should be, even though you did do something about it at the time. Your family suffer. Your family suffer so much. Yeah. Without being disrespectful, the process that carries on. You've got lower paid workers in the HAs being awarded for bad doing because they fob you off for the big cats, the CEO, the managers. They didn't get the job right, so they send it to the low workers. And that is where the problem is. If you've got a problem with your tenant and you can't solve it, you need to go about it the right way. The tenant just wants honesty, No matter who's to blame, they need to know that it's going to be fixed. If they can't fix it, we will in the end. Something will be done, not leave us to where we're ignored, we're gaslighted. Honestly, it's things can, do you know what? We don't even need government help for this.
Yeah.
It can be done, Hannah. In the
agree.
association itself, they're independent, they're not independently watched. So they mark their own homework. So what do we expect?
You make a great point.
So Hannah, what do you think of what Carol's been saying? Thanks, Carol, that's brilliant.
That you've articulated wonderfully a couple of interviews that came up in my thesis, and this is why, because I sometimes get criticised for not focusing on adding to the case that there should be more affordable housing. Well, quite frankly, duh, we know there should be more affordable housing. The case has already been very, very, very adequately made, and we need to understand why this case is not resonating as much as it is. And I absolutely agree with you. There's things that landlords could do now, and that's what my report really tried to focus on, was understanding why landlords were not, even after telling me they wanted to, were not wanting to work with me on reimagining the allocations process as a home creation process. So say the report was initially meant to be reporting on a pilot of using these emotional insights to create a model that a landlord could use to remedy the problems or work with the problems that you're talking about. A lot of this, not a lot of follow through. And this is why I drew out what I thought were key barriers, because there are genuinely good people in the housing sector. I'm going to talk about I worked in it for 18 years and I've met them. I've also met some terrible people. But broadly speaking, it's about how can we... It all
depends on the situation, Hannah.
Yeah.
It's not the person, it's your situation. If you're in a bad situation, then it's stalemate for all. If it's a situation that can do, then you're laughing. Do you get me? These are new build homes, what I'm in. In my old home, I didn't have this problem. As soon as they put me in a new build home, housing associations, and this does involve the government, they're letting them do disability homes, yet they've got no workers who deal with disabled people. They're putting appliances in, that's wrong. There's so many problems, and I'm a farming example, and I have been since 2019, and I'm still here now. And that's why I'm here trying to make change, because without no names mentioned, but someone in my housing association, I said, look, we need change. There's too many people in my small area that's having accidents and things going on because of the properties not being developed correctly.
Yeah.
I got told it won't make a difference. Now that was enough for me to do this.
I think there's something about, this is where the difficult conversations are coming in and what's being avoided. And I'm only saying this as an example. I don't know if this applies to your case. It might be, my approach to this would be to go, right, we need to work with you guys to find out what the problems are. It might not be possible to rectify the problems in your properties, but you can then take the lessons on so future people don't have the problems. And I think there's a tendency to avoid those difficult conversations and go, we got it wrong. And, you know, maybe it's because there's a lot of like suing going on or something. I don't really know, but I've always found when
the problem is where the problem comes in as well, Anna, is the change you complain. So when you've got numerous things going on in your home, several, then you complain to them about them several things. They say, oh no, you can only do a couple on your complaint. Then when they get involved, a surveyor will come and check them all out, and they'll add more and more as you go along. No.
Are you familiar with the 4 Million Homes campaign?
I do. I'm in the middle of emailing Sarah about this.
Excellent.
So,
okay, I'm going to have to come in. So brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Carol. And I think what it really showcases is the importance at every part of the process, really, of and the value that can be derived from co-production. And by that, we need to speak and understand individual circumstances and then apply that into practice. So we're out of time. So, or almost. I know that Leslie's had her hand up, so I don't want to cut Leslie out. So I'm going to hand over to Leslie, and then I'm just going to wrap up. So Leslie, last.
I think that just off of what Carol was saying, Like, this is what is my bugbear when the whole sector has moved towards calling people customers, because in Carol's situation, it demonstrates she doesn't have a choice. If you are like she was saying, if you happen to be with a landlord that listens, great. If you happen to be with a landlord that doesn't listen, you're stuck. So referring to tenants as customers, there is no choice to move or to just go, well, I don't actually want to deal with these people, I'm going to move. So you're kind of stuck. So that, I just wanted to reiterate, that is a real huge bugbear of mine. And then I'll just hand back over to you, Darren. Thanks.
Agreed.
Thank you. So, I mean, that's a good place to leave. I'm sorry we've not got more time. I think it's the kind of subject here where we could have talked for the rest of the afternoon on this. There's clearly a lot of things that are a lot of challenges, a lot of things to work through if we're going to kind of deliver on this agenda. Fortunately, it's part of a campaign that we've got. Let's put the heart back into housing. So this isn't going to be the last. This is really kind of a launch event for the first report, which is going to be part of a series which we're going to be doing in the long term. So we've mentioned various things as we've gone through. We've mentioned the frameworks that are available for us to be able to work with tenants, tenant groups, landlord organisations to apply some of this thinking to real practical situations. We mentioned our Respect for All Charter as well, and the kind of wraparound services that exist with that. Hopefully we've provided some food for thought in terms of topical issues for us to explore in the future. I know we've not managed to get to all of the comments that were made in the chat or the questions that were raised, but if there are things that you wanted to follow up on today, get in touch with us on info@taroetrust.org.uk. There's our link. We're on LinkedIn, we're on Twitter. We've got our website as well, www.taroetrust.org.uk. So a range of different ways that you can get in touch with us. I guess the kind of final things really just to say is, if you've not already read the report, we'll include a link in the post-event follow-up so that you can get hold of that. We hope that it adds to the general knowledge and debate in this important area. A massive thank you to Hannah to explain this really valuable research, and pleased that we could have you on and to explore this further. I'm really pleased that we were able to work with you as well moving forward on some of this also.
Privilege. Yeah.
And indeed, as to come back to what I was saying earlier, it's a privilege to be able to kind of work on this type of work and the insights into people's lives. Some of that is itself challenging, but hopefully rewarding, so that we can apply some of those insights for the benefit of tenants more generally in the sector. So thanks everyone for joining today. We'll be posting this recording on YouTube as soon as we can, hopefully later today. We'll distribute links to all of that as well as standard. And just a big thank you to everyone involved for making this launch event happen. So enjoy the rest of your day.
Everyone.
Thank you everyone for spending your time today to discuss this, and please do keep up with what TAROE Trust are doing. I think they're doing some absolutely excellent work, and I really appreciate your time in listening to my thoughts based on my research.
Enjoy the rest of the day, everybody, and see you all soon. Thanks.
All
Take
right.
care. Bye now. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.